If the brains of psychopaths do function differently, does this mean that the structure of their brains is different? Bob Hare, Andra Smith, and their colleagues employed magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. This technique allows researchers to study the brain in fine detail from many angles. So far, the results of this technique have not revealed any structural differences. One of the most convincing studies of the brains of psychopaths involves single photon emission computerized tomography, or SPECT. In this process, harmless amounts of radioactive tracers are injected into a subject's bloodstream. Activity in specific areas of the brain can then be observed. The white and red colors indicate the areas of highest mental activity. The green and blue colors indicate less activity.
The SPEC study was done in New York at the Bronx VA Hospital under the direction of Dr. Joanne Intrator. And it was really the first of its sort ever done. Nobody had ever looked at psychopaths before in this particular way. And the task was the lexical decision paradigm. Again, a letter string flashed on the screen will either form a word or it will not. And you decide as quickly as possible if you see a word by pushing a button. And some of the words are neutral in connotation, some are emotional or affective in connotation. And we know from other studies that normal individuals process neutral and emotional information differently. We also know from event-related potential studies measuring EEG in a lexical decision task that psychopaths actually differ from normal individuals in the way they process this sort of information. To make a long story short, the psychopath seems to interpret, process, and perhaps use emotional information as if it was neutral information. So the brain potentials that we would record from the surface of the scalp, from the surface of the skull of psychopaths, would look the same to neutral as to emotional words in this lexical decision paradigm, which is quite intriguing and tells us that perhaps the psychopath doesn't really extract emotional information from words in the same way that most other people would do. So this led to the brain imaging study, the SPEC study done in New York. The normal individual, the non-psychopathic individual, shows widespread activation of the brain in performing this particular task, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. The task is simple on the surface. Is it a word? Push a button. But on the other hand, the brain processes involved are very complex. Many different parts of the brain have to be activated. And this is exactly what we find with the non-psychopathic individual in this task. And it's represented by widespread activation in the brain, indicating that language areas are highly activated. You can certainly see them in the slides. And some activity towards frontal part of the brain. In fact, there's a very nice anterior-posterior gradient where most of the activity is towards the front part of the brain. Also some activity on the right side as well. Now, for the emotional words, which are all negative in connotation, we see that there's fairly substantial activation in the right hemisphere as well, which is not unusual. We know that the right hemisphere plays an important role in processing negative emotion, negative affect. If we look at the psychopaths, we get quite a different picture. And in fact, the slides themselves are almost too dramatic. People would look at them and say, well, there's something wrong here. Are you really looking at somebody who's awake and alert and active? Well, in fact, these individuals were active. They were performing the task as well as the non-psychopaths were performing, but different parts of the brain were activated. You can see quite clearly that, in fact, the part of the brain that was activated most was the occipital cortex, the back part of the brain. Now, this is rather intriguing when you think about it. Well, the input is visual, so much of the information is going to the back part of the brain for initial processing. And then, of course, presumably it should move forward, backwards, up, down, and around different parts of the brain. But this doesn't seem to be happening here. With the psychopath, the task is being performed primarily in the posterior parts of the brain. Now, we know from other studies involving brain imaging studies that, in fact, it is possible to make a decision about whether or not what you see is a word in the posterior part of the brain. It's not necessary that other parts of the brain become highly active, but it's pretty hard for a normal individual to see a word like cancer or rape or death. without actually drawing all sorts of other associations, cognitive affective associations. You may have an image, conscious or subconscious, of what's going on. You may think of somebody as, oh, do I have cancer? All these different things. And this would activate other parts of the brain. For the psychopath, that seems not to be the case. It's as if the task is very straightforward. Is it a word or not? Who cares what it says? I'm going to process it in the same way, in a very superficial manner. What we're now beginning to believe is that the psychopath is not characterized only by some sort of difficulty in processing and using emotional information. We're beginning to believe now that, in fact, the problem is much deeper than that. And I suppose one could describe it by saying that the psychopath is an individual who is either not capable of or does not engage in deep semantic or affective processing. It's almost as if everything that he or she does is fairly superficial on the surface. And there are a couple of fairly recent studies that indicate that this is probably a pretty viable line of research to pursue. That's looking at the deep semantic and other processing. Maybe it's not restricted to semantic processing. Maybe it's that deep processing of any sort is a difficult thing for the psychopath. For individuals who are critics or observers who say, well, these brain images are very interesting, does that represent some sort of brain damage, or does it mean that they're wired up differently, or these people are simply different inherently, genetically, or biologically? Well, we don't really know. The images themselves, by themselves, don't really tell us what the cause of the differences is. It's quite possible that the differences we see, and this would apply to many tasks that we use in the study of psychology, it may be that the differences are primarily the response of differences in strategy. It may very well be that they can perform the task reasonably well, but using different parts of the brain. This isn't to say that they can't use the appropriate parts of the brain, simply that they don't.